post-traumatic depression on a nationwide scale through fear of job loss in Singapore. Psychologists and social workers are seeing more distressed individuals seeking help due to retrenchment or imminent job loss. Challenges of being retrenched are amplified during the COVID-19 health crisis amid anxiety over mortality and feelings of hopelessness, said social workers. Inability to provide for the family may lead to pressure and stress on unemployed persons, which in turn affect their relationships. A psychologist in Singapore noted that social distancing restrictions have inadvertently impaired the social support that one would normally receive. Affected individuals can take steps to help themselves cope, he said, but support from family and friends are important too, and this takes an immense mental toll on those Singaporeans who are finding a job market that is now less than 1/10 of the population, meaning 1 in 10 people unemployed.
মানে আমাদের একটা চাকরি হারানোর একটা ভয়, এই ভয়টা মানে এখন এই সবার মধ্যে একটা কাজ করছে আর কি, যে চাকরিটা হয়তো চলে যেতে পারে। যেমন আমরা যারা প্রবাসে থাকি, আমাদের পরিবারকে একটা নির্দিষ্ট অ্যামাউন্ট প্রতি মাসে তাদেরকে দিতে হয়। তো দেখা যাচ্ছে যে সেই সমস্যাটা সামনে এসে দাঁড়াবে। আমি তাদেরকে দেখা যাচ্ছে যে সহযোগিতা করতে পারছি না, কারণ আমি দেখা যাচ্ছে যে আমার ফ্যামিলির আমি 5 জন সদস্য, তারা আমার দিকে তাকিয়ে থাকে।
So there will be a lot of men who are simply sent home, and Singapore certainly isn't required to maintain all the men who are physically present in Singapore now. There will be a reduction in the construction sector.
Once the workers recover, and certainly in the coming weeks we hope that the vast majority of them will have recovered, they will be able to resume work. And there will be work to do. I do expect, because the projects are there, the work is there, I do expect many of the contractors and employers to want the workers to resume work as soon as possible.
আমি যেহেতু তখন আমার কোনো সেভিংস থাকবে না, তো দেশে যে আমি এই মুহূর্তে হঠাৎ করে আমি যে কোনো ব্যবসাও শুরু করতে পারবো না, কিংবা কোনো ঋণ নিয়েও শুরু করতে পারবো না, কারণ ইতিমধ্যে আমি যে এখানে আসছি আমার অলরেডি অনেকগুলো টাকা অলরেডি ঋণ আছে। তো আমি নতুন করে আবার দেখা যাচ্ছে যে আমাকে তখন ঋণ নিয়ে শুরু করতে হবে।
You're listening to The Voluntary Life, where you can hear ideas for finding freedom in an unfree world. Visit thevoluntarylife.com to connect with the show and hear all past episodes. Here's your host, Jake.
Hi, it's Jake here. Welcome to The Voluntary Life. Something a bit different this week. I've been reading an interesting book that was written in the 90s, and it's called The Sovereign Individual. And it's by James Dale Davidson and William Rees-Mogg. And I will put links in the show notes so that you can find it if you're interested. But this is a chat that I had with a friend of mine about the book. It's a Skype conversation with Mark, who you may remember from the episode about investing in Europe. So just as a background, here's some information about the book from the dust jacket so that you know what the book's about. In The Sovereign Individual, Davidson and Rees-Mogg explore the greatest economic and political transition in centuries, the shift from an industrial to an information-based society. Important geopolitical and economic discontinuities that others have missed have culminated in a nearly universal depression, the scope of which is not yet appreciable to the general population. At the same time, technical and economic innovations will no longer be the exclusive property of a small fraction of the globe. This break with the past and the emergence in its wake of what Davidson and Rees-Mogg have termed the fourth stage of human history will render impossible the preservation of many contemporary institutions that undergird modern Western civilization. The information revolution will liberate individuals as never before, but the attendant and unaccustomed responsibility will sharply curtail the unearned advantage in living standards that the average 20th century citizen of an advanced industrial society has enjoyed. As human transactions occur increasingly in the parallel universe of the cyber economy and outside of the confines of government regulation, the individual's relationship to the state will be altered irrevocably. The implications of such a reconfiguration will become evident within our own lifetime and will reverberate around the globe. Davidson and Rees-Mogg bring to light both currents of disaster and the potential for prosperity and renewal in the face of radical changes in human history. This outstanding book will replace false hopes and fictions with new understanding and clarified values. And it also says on the back, in the Sovereign Individual, they predict the collapse of the welfare state and the death of nations worldwide, the overhaul of the US tax system, which will in future be based on consumption rather than earnings, that the map of the world, including the United States and Canada, will look dramatically different, that governments will lose their capacity to arbitrarily regulate economies, that banks will suffer through even larger crises than that of the 1980s, that the US government will diminish to the size that it was in the 19th century, that the US government, primarily the IRS, CIA, and NSA, will declare war on groups that try to circumvent the income tax through cyberspace, that organized crime will grow in scope as central economies break down, that central banks will lose their power to inflate and control the money supply as paper money is supplanted by cybercash, that individuals will gain more autonomy and financial capability than ever before as markets deepen around the world, that morality will make a comeback. So those are the ideas that they're talking about in this book. And in this conversation, we just pick up the discussion of some of the topics that they cover. And I hope you enjoy the conversation. Thank you so much for listening.
I have to admit that I have not read all of this book either. I'm in the process of reading it at the moment. But I'll give you a basic rundown of the argument as I see it, and we can sort of take it from there, because a lot of the book is historical. It's backing up this main argument. Mm-hmm. But the argument, basically, that, as far as I see it, is this. He says, so it's written by these two guys, James Dale Davidson and William Rees-Mogg. And their argument is that when it comes to social change, it's not so much what people's ideology is and what people believe and want to try and do that kind of makes for big political and social changes. Their argument is that looking back on history, the big political changes and social changes happen when technology changes. And they argue that nobody sees it coming and nobody really necessarily is like very aware that these technological changes are going to cause huge shifts. But in hindsight, you can see that when technology changes, that the morals of a society and the political organization of a society change. And their argument is that the most important reason that things change is because what technology changes is what they call the logic of using violence. So the basic argument is that in any society, you have a certain possibility of some people to use violence to exploit others. And when technology changes, that changes kind of, the statism of the times, right? And so they give an example, which is that in the time of the American Revolution, you had this situation where Benjamin Franklin and all of these sort of founding fathers were talking about all men are created equal. And he makes the point that that is a believable ideology or statement when everybody can have like a musket, you know, like the American farmers all had their own guns, right? And the British troops that were the colonial army in America, they had guns too. And basically one musket against another musket is pretty much equal, right? And he makes the point that if you go back to medieval times, you had a knight in full armor with a sword and an armored horse. And that knight against a local peasant who, at the best, he had like some kind of, you know, agricultural tool, like a pitchfork or something like that, right? The inequality there is much bigger. And so, you know, you can talk about all men being equal, but actually the technology of the time kind of meant that some people could exercise violence on other people and control them through violence in a much more direct and overpowering way. And they go through these series of historical examples of how technology has sort of changed the logic of violence, as they call it. And basically the idea being that there are some times in history when it's easier for some people to create a state and to rule over other people. And there are other times when when states get broken up and it becomes more difficult. And they go through this historical analysis where they suggest that, you know, you had, with the development of agriculture, a series of different stages of agricultural societies where, first of all, you had in the period before Christ, you had like these smaller political entities, with the founding of like the Greek sort of republics and all that kind of stuff. Then you had Rome, this big empire, which went on until 500 AD, and then even though nobody at the time really knew it, Rome basically collapsed and broke up into all these small overlapping political entities in the Dark Ages. And then you had, in the period of 1000 AD to like about 1500, this medieval times where you had serfdom and the knights and all of that kind of stuff. That sort of changed the setup. And then you had what he calls industrial society, which is like 1500 until the year 2000, until now, basically, where you had big nation states controlling their citizens, using taxation, using fiat currency, and everyone is kind of locked in to these individual states. And the whole argument of the book is basically that when microprocessors were developed, that started to change. That technology is currently and is going to continue to change the sort of logic of what is possible in terms of violence, in terms of exploitation, if you like, by a state, by people who call themselves a state of other people. And he basically argues that now that you can connect to other people in cyberspace across geography, you can link up to other people and trade with them and contact them and communicate with them and continue business with them outside of the sort of physical area of your nation state. He argues that it's going to be easier and easier for people to basically shop around the world and find a place where they want to live, where they get less exploited by their government. And he kind of argues that what's going to happen is that the nation state is going to collapse, and that it just won't be sort of viable for gangs who call themselves governments to control a population in the way that they have done during the industrial period, that everything's going to get a lot more internationalized, and people will become much more open to moving around and finding their own place where they want to live. And that is going to mean that the nation state as we know it is going to go. And I mean, that's kind of the argument that I got from it. And he goes on, as I'm reading it, he's going to go on to talk about, you know, how you yourself can try to be on the leading edge of this process and take advantage of it. But he does point out a number of things. This was written in the 1990s, and he points out a number of things because it's already quite an old book. It was written in 97, I think. And he says a number of things that are interesting that he sort of thinks are going to happen. He talks about the fact that he thinks that cyber currencies will develop, so that fiat currencies, it will be harder and harder for governments to control people through fiat currencies because they will go to alternative currency systems on the internet. And he also talks about how he thinks that in the period of decline of the nation states, there's going to be a lot more kind of attempts to clamp down and control people's incomes. And I suppose you could argue that you know, we're seeing signs of that now. He also talks about the devaluation of fiat currencies and that continuing in the short term. But ultimately, I think it's quite an optimistic book because it sort of argues that the technology is going to make something like true individual market anarchism or market individualism possible. That the technology itself is going to mean that, you know, we could potentially be moving into an era where we kind of outgrow government, I suppose. And the way that's going to happen is not by people having an ideological change where they try and like vote in different rulers or whatever. It's going to be that society itself starts to just sort of get on with it without governments, and people move around and create their own financial and trading connections that are sort of independent of governments, I suppose, by being more international sovereign individuals, as he calls them. So that's the sort of broad argument that I get from the book in sort of in a summary. And yeah, I wonder what do you think about that?
Yeah, very interesting. I'm especially interested in the second part where he talks about, but I'm not sure if it's really there, about what you can do and how you can live a sovereign life. Are there even chapters on that, or it's not really discussed?
I'm just looking at the contents now, and because unfortunately I haven't finished the whole book, so I don't know for sure, but I don't think this is so much discussed in this book. I think this is more like kind of like an intellectual book. Like, I think this is going to happen, and it's not like, you know, ways of going offshore, and it's not. I don't think it's so much a help book in that sense. And also, it's quite old, so any techniques or ideas that he has about that are going to be a bit out of date now anyway, you know.
Okay, I had the wrong impression of the book then. I only today discovered it's actually a history book mostly.
Yeah.
So then I'm wondering, what's your impression of his analysis of history?
I'm not sure what to think about it yet. I think it's very interesting. I appreciate that he takes like the question of how some groups use violence to control other people as being a key question as to how society is organized, because I think that's a very important and fundamental thing that a lot of people sort of ignore, because they just assume that there is some kind of thing called society which we all take part in and somehow are all citizens of, as opposed to, you know, he kind of is looking at it more in terms of how some people basically exploit others and what the potential for that to happen is, right? And I think that's a very useful way of looking at the state, because I think that's what the state is. So I think it's interesting. It's an interesting idea, and I certainly think it's true that, or rather, not so much it's true. It makes sense to look at some parts of history as being more like an agricultural society, hunter-gatherer, and then agricultural, and then industrial, and then, you know, the argument is we're getting into something new, like an information society, which sort of has a different kind of connectedness, where people, because we are using the internet and computers to create connections between people across the whole planet, that we're into some kind of slightly new period in terms of the way that technology influences our lives. And I think that is true, right? That this is a new time. I have no idea how it's going to play out, but it does seem that the changes that have happened in the last 40 years or so seem pretty significant in the way that they change how people across the planet can link up and create their own relationships independent of the, quote, countries that they're born into.
I have some skepticism about his basic theory that history is written on the kind of weaponry. Also, basically, technology, weaponry technology has created society. And I'm thinking, well, sure, I fully agree. It's super interesting. He's approaching history from the violence perspective, and I fully agree that the state is violence. But when I look at, okay, so when you look at the Romans or the barbarians, or like the only difference is between them and us is just the scale. But for the rest, there is nothing different that I see when it comes to how society is organized. So the gang mob basically has become bigger. Although even there you can dispute that, because the Romans were also quite big, and so were the Mongolians, and so were the Chinese 5,000 years ago. So it's, or yeah, that my timing can be wrong there, but like I find that argument about the weaponry deciding having any influence on creating, progressing from a tribal community to a basically agricultural revolution and then industrial one. Like, I don't see any weaponry involved there.
Just to be clear, clarify one thing. I may not have explained it so well. I don't think it's the weaponry that he's talking about. Although I did mention the example of like the difference between two guys with muskets and the knight. But I mean, for example, what he's talking about with regard to the internet and computing is that's not weaponry that's changing things, but it's changing the fact that technology is changing the logic of how easy it is for some people to exploit others with violence. So, for example, like the internet and microprocessors are not weaponry themselves, they are technology. But when those things are implemented, when there's widespread use of those things, then he's saying that makes it feasible for people to trade with each other, to connect with each other, to get information from each other, and to exist much more independently of their own government, right? And that itself changes the logic of how the guys who call themselves a nation state can exploit their citizens. And in some ways, like, I would say, this is just to kind of back up his argument, I would say that I think there is some truth in that, you know, the internet allows you to exist independently of the mainstream media. You can get your own information and news. And the cyber economy, independent of the state, hasn't really happened yet. I mean, yeah, we have Bitcoin, but I mean, it's tiny. There's not really that much going on there. And there's not like this whole massive wild frontier of tax-free commerce going on the internet using Bitcoin or something like that. So I'm not sure that this is really happened yet. But just to clarify, I don't think he's so much saying that it's the technology of weapons per se. It's just the technology changes, like the logic of how easy it is for some people to exploit each other, and also the way in which they can do it may change, you know?
Yeah, but does he believe, like, I don't, have you, yeah, does he believe, the author, that thanks to, okay, technology, and then in this today, that's mostly communication technology, does he believes that thanks to that, that the level of violence will go down?
I think he thinks that it will change and it will become much more individualized. So he has some arguments about, you know, people like there will be different kinds of force and fraud will be used, but it won't be so much like totalitarian nation states. I think his main argument is that the centralized control aspect of totalitarian nation states becomes less and less easy to do when everyone has an internet connection and they're able to trade and talk to each other like around the world, right? I think that's his basic argument, is that it becomes harder and harder to create a kind of tax and spend and tax and military industrial complex, like big nation states fighting each other, if their citizens can have these independent communications and independent trade and can also potentially go and live anywhere else in the world and still carry on making a living on the internet. Like, I think that's his basic idea.
Yeah, well, I have one idea going against that. It's another book I read, and he wrote that, yes, thanks to these innovations in communication, and it used to be mostly transportation at the time, but today communication, due to that, the reach of people becomes wider. And that way, trade also becomes wider, and local rulers lose their grip on the people. But in that book, it's also explained that rulers adapt, and they just create also bigger circles, bigger areas,
right,
that cover their. So, and that way they are following. And that's also what's happening still today. Here in Europe, for example, like, you get more and more trade between the countries, but now the borders are gone and the rulers are uniting in one parliament.
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. Absolutely.
And then you see the same even happening on a world scale already today.
You know what I think, actually, you saying that really just makes me think. I agree with you, and I think I'm not sure whether or not the internet is going to fundamentally disrupt the nation state in the way that this guy thinks it will do. I think what it does mean is that it is becoming easier to be a sovereign individual. I would agree with this, that, like, for example, it's certainly true that the internet makes it much easier to become location independent, right? You can build up a business online and you can have some kind of service provision or something online. And if you move to New Zealand or Brazil or, I don't know, Russia or something else, your business can still be going, right? And bringing you income. And you don't lose everything in the way that if you, in 1930, if you had developed a business and then you decided to move to New Zealand or something, that's it. You have to start all over again, right?
Yeah, I fully agree with that argument, Sheikh. That's really true, yeah.
So I don't know if it's true that overall everybody is going to become sovereign individuals. I don't know if it's true that the nation state itself will, crumble under the pressure. But I think it is true that we can become sovereign individuals. Individual people can make that choice.
jobs.
Which college or which university?
It's not. There's no need even to have a college degree.
Oh, wow. Okay.
At all, or even high school. I mean, if somebody graduated from a great university, that may be an indication that they will be capable of great things, but it's not necessarily the case. You know, if you look at, say, people like Bill Gates or Larry Ellison, Steve Jobs, these guys didn't graduate from college.
Dropouts, yeah.
But if you had a chance to hire them, of course, that would be a good idea.
Yeah, okay.
So, you know, just looking just for evidence of exceptional ability. And if there's a track record of exceptional achievement, then it's likely that that will continue into the future. How I describe myself? Well, I mean, I seem to have a high innate drive. And that's been true even since I was a little kid. You know, I really had a very strong drive. Did all sorts of risky things when I was a kid that like, why did I do those things? They're crazy. I care a lot about the truth of things and trying to understand the truth of things. I think that's important. You know, if you're going to come up with some solution, then the truth is really, really important, I think. I try to think of, I mean, it's difficult to obviously come up with like things that are praise for oneself, you know, or like, there's bad and good here, but I think like sometimes they're just like the things that seem quite clear and obvious to me, and I don't understand why they aren't so obvious to everyone. Sure.
So how would you educate your 5 boys?
Actually, I created a little school. Yeah.
What kind of school? Could you describe to us?
Sure. I mean, it's small. It's only got 14 kids now, and it'll have 20 kids in September. It's called Ad Astra, which means to the stars. That's maybe a bit different from most other schools, is that there aren't any grades. There's no like not grade 1, grade 2, grade 3 type of thing. Making all the children go in the same grade at the same time, like an assembly line.
I know.
You know, because some people love English or languages, some people love math, some people love music, and they have different abilities at different times. It makes more sense to cater the education to match their aptitudes and abilities. So I think that's one principle. Another is that it's important to teach problem solving, or teach to the problem, not to the tools. So this would be like, let's say you're trying to teach people about how engines work, or you know, you could start by a more traditional approach would be to say, well, we're going to teach you all about screwdrivers and wrenches, and you're going to have a course on screwdrivers, a course on wrenches, and all these things. And this is a very difficult way to do it. A much better way would be like, here's the engine. Now let's take it apart. How are we going to take it apart? Oh, you need a screwdriver. That's what the screwdriver is for. You need a wrench. That's what the wrench is for. And then a very important thing happens, which is that the relevance of the tools becomes apparent.
So all your 5 boys are in that school?
Yes.
Until when? This is from preschool?
I don't know. So far it's only 1-year-old. They like it. They like it? Yeah.
And you want to keep them away from regular schools?
No, I just didn't see that the regular schools, they weren't doing the things that I thought should be done. Like, you know, those 2 principles, they weren't adhering to those principles. So I thought, well, let's see what we can do. Maybe creating a school will be better. And I actually hired a teacher from the school they were at, who also agreed with me that there was a better way to do it.
Have they surprised you in a way of their innovative thinking?
Yeah, it seems to be going pretty well. I mean, the kids really love going to school. I think that's a good sign. You know, I mean, I hated going to school when I was a kid. It was torture. So the fact that they actually think vacations are too long, like they want to go back to school.
Wow.
Yeah, exactly.
That's weird.
I know.
Age or people like that, what is it you have in common with them?
Well, I mean, those are pretty different personalities, you know, between Gates and Jobs and Ellison.
Business and success?
I think, you know, all 3 of those were technologists, but with different types of skills. You know, Jobs was obviously very good with aesthetics, and you know, he understood technology, of course, and he really understood what people wanted even when they didn't know themselves. And he was not afraid to break boundaries. But like say, like Gates would probably be better at sort of raw engineering and technology than Jobs, but not as good on aesthetics. But I mean, for all of these guys, they're obviously very driven, and they're very talented, and they're able to attract great people to build a company. But I mean, the ability to attract and motivate great people is critical to the success of a company, because a company is it's a group of people that are assembled to create a product or service. That's the purpose of a company. People sometimes forget this elementary truth, and so if you're able to get great people to join the company and work together towards a common goal, and you sort of have a relentless sense of perfection about that goal, then you will end up with a great product. And if you have a great product, lots of people will buy it, and then the company will be successful.
Yeah.
But really, it's pretty straightforward, really. I mean, yeah, that's the reason for it. I wouldn't say I'm fearless. In fact, I think I feel fear quite strongly. But if what we're doing is what I'm doing is I think is important enough, then I just override the fear.
Mm-hmm.
So, but it's not as though I don't feel. I feel it like more strongly than I would like.
And in which areas would you never go full risk if you still are fearful?
Well, it really depends on the stakes. If the stakes are high, if it's really important, then I will overcome the fear and just do it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But essentially, I mean, I just drive overrides fear, but I feel the fear. It's kind of annoying. I wish I didn't.
Okay.
I wish I felt it less.
Uh-huh.
So, yeah. And all these introspective questions are interesting. I don't get asked these very often. And then, like, I'm trying to think, like, what is like an accurate reply? And some of these, it's hard to evaluate yourself in these things.
Mm-hmm.
Which company you founded was the most risky at the start?
Well, probably SpaceX. I thought it had the lowest chance of success. I mean, I thought both Tesla and SpaceX would fail at the beginning.
You thought?
Yeah, sure.
Really?
Of course.
But nevertheless, you put all your money in that, in both.
I expected to lose it. Well, technically, what I thought was, well, I'll take half the money from PayPal, and if I lose half of it, that's okay. But then, of course, the companies encounter difficulties, and then I have a choice of either let the company die, or put, all the money into the companies. And so I really didn't want the companies to die, so I put all the money in the companies.
Yeah.
And then I had to borrow money from friends to pay living expenses.
Yes. What was your best idea ever?
My best idea ever?
Yeah.
This is tricky. I suppose coming to North America was my best idea.
Okay.
Because I think these things would not have been accomplished, almost anywhere else. It's really hard to start a company, but in particularly California, Silicon Valley is very conducive to startup companies, and so whenever I'd read books in South Africa, it would seem like the cutting edge of technology was in Silicon Valley, and so that's when I wanted to come and I wanted to move to this mythical place.
Okay.
And are there things you regret having done or for not having done so far?
Well, there's lots of things that, when life is short, and there's lots of things that could be done that one can't necessarily do. And these really are introspective questions. I think, I mean, overall, I think I'm pretty happy with what where things are. It's hard not to be, honestly.
Yeah.
You know, I'd be, yeah. Things are in a good place right now, and I mean, I'd like to, looking ahead, I'd like to see humanity go beyond Earth and have people on Mars. That would be really great. And to see widespread adoption of electric vehicles and renewable energy. These are great things. And yeah, I think those would be really, really cool.
Welcome to Top 10 Archive. We've all heard it, had it drilled into our minds since we were old enough to first put on a backpack. If you want to be successful, then you have to go to college. It's the only way to success, right? Well, that's not always the case. And although we always suggest to further your education, sometimes you can make your own way in this world without immediately going into debt after you turn 18, as seen with these 10 individuals. Number 10, Ted Turner. Network mogul and entrepreneurial acumen Ted Turner would find a multitude of success throughout his career, even though he hadn't completed college. His father, Robert Edward Turner Jr., owned the successful Turner Advertising Company, which found its success via billboard ad sales. After a brief stint at a boarding school in Chattanooga, Tennessee, Ted would be encouraged to enroll in Harvard by his father. But because his grades weren't of the required levels for Harvard, he would instead enroll in Brown University, though he'd be kicked out for having a woman in his dorm. It wasn't until 1960 that Ted was made the manager of Turner Advertising's Georgia branch, and in 1963, after a costly buyout of a competitor about bankrupt the company, Ed Turner would take his own life, leaving Ted as president of what is now called Turner Communications. Currently, as of 2016, Ted Turner is worth a modest $2.2 billion. Number 9, Ty Warner. Creator of the Beanie Baby, Ty Warner would enroll in Kalamazoo College in Michigan, where he majored in drama. After a short stint, Ty would drop out then to move to Hollywood, California, where he would go in search of an acting career. With that failing, he would work a number of odd jobs. While he was working one of these jobs as a camera salesman, he would be introduced to a representative for the toy company Dakin in 1962. He would work for Dakin for 18 years, and in 1980 he would depart from the company to visit and stay with some friends in Italy. Inspired by the stuffed animals there, he would return to the United States and begin producing Beanie Babies in the early 1990s. As of 2016, Ty Warner is worth about $2.5 billion. Number 8, Oprah Winfrey. Philanthropist, actress, and billionaire, Oprah Winfrey wasn't always in such good standings in life. She was molested by numerous male relatives and friends of her mother until she moved to Nashville to live with her father. In 1971, she enrolled in Tennessee State University, and in 1976, she dropped out and moved to Baltimore to pursue a job offer. As the new host for People Are Talking, the show grew to become a sensation, with Oprah at the helm for 8 years, until she was approached by a station in Chicago to host her own morning show. The rest is pretty much history, and as of 2016, Oprah is worth an impressive $3 billion. Number 7, Steve Jobs. Co-founder of Apple Computers alongside Steve Wozniak, Steve Jobs would quickly become a name recognized across the globe. After high school, Jobs would enroll in Reed College in Portland, Oregon. Feeling lost and directionless, he would drop out less than a year later, and in 1974, Steve would take a job with Atari. Leaving Atari just a few months after, Jobs made his way to India, where he experimented with psychedelic drugs for spiritual enlightenment. 2 years later, Jobs would return to the United States and form Apple Computer with his old high school friend Steve Wozniak. Working out of their garages, the company would grow to become a multi-billion-dollar company, and at the time of his death in 2011, he was reportedly worth $10.2 billion. Number 6, Paul Allen. When you think of Microsoft, you usually think of Bill Gates, but does the name Paul Allen ring a bell? It should, as without Paul, then Microsoft probably never would have happened. After just 2 years of college at Washington State University, Paul would convince Bill Gates to drop out and co-create the company known as Microsoft in 1975. In 1985, Allen would resign from Microsoft, But this wasn't due to a falling out, as Paul and Bill remain friends to this day, but because he was diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease. As of 2016, Paul Allen is worth $17.4 billion. Number 5. Michael Dell. It wasn't until Michael Dell was enrolled at the University of Texas that he would find his calling. Realizing that the home computer was still a fairly new concept and no one had tried to sell it directly to the consumer, Dell would close out his savings account and begin building personal computers from his dorm room in college. Focusing on more than just the machine itself, Dell provided affordable prices, amazing customer support, and a bond of customer relations that had almost been lost in the times. It wasn't long until he had clients outside of his school, and he was forced to drop out to meet the expectations of his customers. This decision, however, proved to be well worth it, as in 1984, his first full year of operations, he made an impressive $6 million. Now, as of 2016, Michael Dell is worth just shy of $20 billion. Number 4. Mukesh Ambani. Not all of these success stories are underdog tales, as in the case of Mukesh Ambani, who was born the son of the Indian business tycoon Dhirubhai Ambani. Mukesh would enroll himself into Stanford University, but was forced to drop out to aid his father with the family startup company, Reliance, which had grown quickly. Through his leadership, the company would boom as it expanded over multiple sectors such as petroleum refining and gas exploration. As of 2016, Mukesh is worth a staggering $20.8 billion, which he isn't afraid to show. He lives with his family in one of the most expensive residential houses ever built, estimated to be worth more than $1 billion. Number 3. Mark Zuckerberg. As co-founder and CEO of the largest social media website known as Facebook, he has also become one of the world's youngest billionaires to date. In 2002, Mark would enroll at Harvard University, where he would develop and create a program called Course Match, a program that helps students choose their classes, as well as a program called Face Mash. With word of his creative genius spreading across campus rapidly, 3 fellow students would reach out to him to ask for help developing a social network. Though he agreed, he would quickly leave the group to focus on a social networking site with a few other friends. In 2004, after the success of his site, Facebook, he would drop out of college to commit all his time to his craft, a decision that gained him a net worth of $35.7 billion as of 2016. Number 2. Lawrence Ellison. Entrepreneur and CEO Lawrence Ellison founded the Oracle Corporation, but not until he attempted college first. Larry would enroll in the University of Illinois and was even named the Science Student of the Year. During his second year, his adopted mother would pass away, resulting in his departure from college. A year later, he would attempt to go at the University of Chicago, dropping out just after a semester. Deciding he would find his calling out west, he left for Berkeley, California. Broke, and with hardly a belonging to his name, he bounced from job to job, developing limited programming skills in between. In 1977, he and 2 colleagues founded Software Development Labs and were soon under contract to develop a data management system for the CIA. The resulting system was called Oracle, and just a few years later, in 1981, IBM agreed to use it, doubling the company's sales for the next 7 years. Today, the company employs over 130,000 people across the globe, and Lawrence himself is worth an estimated $49.3 billion. Number 1. Bill Gates. This one's pretty much self-explanatory. We know the story. After a normal and uneventful childhood, Bill would attend Harvard University, and in 1974, he was convinced by a friend and fellow billionaire Paul Allen to develop software. In 1975, they created Microsoft, creating the operating system MS-DOS for the computer giant IBM. In 1984, Microsoft released its first retail version of Windows, and by 1993, they had more than 25 million licensed users. Being dubbed the richest man in America in 1993, he would hold onto that title for 18 years. Still astoundingly rich by any measure, as of 2016, Bill is worth $79.2 billion, even after his retirement from Microsoft in 2008.